So I know it's a master file, and I know when the last day was that I worked on it. Okay, so that way I have traceability over my work. If something happens to the latest file, I can go back to a previous one. All right, it's about avoiding unpleasant surprises. When I begin to turn the master file into a story, I put draft, subject, docx. Every day I work on the story, I change the date stamp. If I work on the story more than once in a day, for example, if I have 2 working sessions in the day, the second one becomes V2, version 2. Okay, just always tracking what you're doing on the file, being able to go back to a preceding version. I mean, this takes 3 seconds. If students don't do that, they're really idiots. We don't teach idiots, do we? Rarely, but it happens. Okay, so that's the basic housekeeping, so you can track it. You don't have to do it like me. You just have to have some nomenclature that enables you to follow what you are doing. And I believe very much in date stamps. Okay, so now we have our file. First thing we do is we read through the whole file. So so the information starts talking to us. We should be doing this every day, but life is not perfect. Okay. So we'll be reading through the file. We read through it once or twice. May take a day or so, whatever. But the first thing we do is that. Now, as we are reading through it, we get ideas. We see the meaning of the information. We start to get ideas. We begin to add those notes to the file. So as we read the file, it's going to get longer, but that's okay. It'll get shorter again in a moment. Just taking the time to consider the material and let it inspire us. Okay, see what we have and see how good it is. Maybe we'll see something we don't have too, and we can add that into the file. And in the book, the reporters do not dare to call for his resignation. They don't dare to imagine an ending to the story. Very interesting. It shows you, the limits of news reportage. What did you wish to say, Redouane?
في مثلا قصص تتحدث عن المستقبل ولها علاقة بالماضي، مثلا اكتشاف رفات لمقابر جماعية لأحداث تاريخية سابقة لها علاقة بالضحايا. البحث مثلا عن مصير مختفين قسريا في حروب. في كثير من الأحيان الصحفيين لما يقصوا قصص لها علاقة بالماضي.
Sure. The discovery of a mass grave plunges us straight into the past. Absolutely. I can think of another example, which is William Shawcross's book, Sideshow, which is subtitled Nixon, Kissinger, and the War in Cambodia. And he begins deep in the past of Cambodia. He takes you through the history of the country, and the first chapter ends just as the Americans are about to invade. Okay, so it's very, very powerful. And it's a very deep insight on his part, because he's writing for people who couldn't find Cambodia on a map. They have no idea what this place is, or what its reality is, or what it means to say, oh, we're going to invade Cambodia, we're going to step on their faces. Here come the tanks. So he actually takes the time to make this place real to you before the Americans move in. And it's a very powerful technique. More typically, when you begin in the past, okay, if your students adopt this approach, and they may have done significant historical research on a given subject, okay, if your students adopt this approach, their story should probably begin at the moment when something important is about to happen. The past serves as prologue to an extraordinary event, okay? For example, I remember very well in Paris in the early 2000s, they showed the 40th anniversary of the protest march against the Algerian war that took place in Paris. It's like the example you gave, okay, where there were thousands of Algerians in the street and the police massacred them. And I use the word massacre precisely and literally. Hundreds of men were beaten over the head and thrown into the Seine to die. Okay, hang on just a moment, please, Khadija. And, you know, the revelation of this story took 40 years. The story was covered up for 40 years. So, you know, Libération, which at the time was a very good newspaper, it's less good now. Libération began its story by showing you the march. We're in the past, and then something happens. So we start with a moment where, you know, we're setting the scene, but we understand that something terrible is about to go down. And that's the way a story that begins in the past should be set up. Your students do not need to put all of the past in it. They need to put enough of the past into it to get us to that moment where something is about to happen. Okay, they need to move quickly. Okay, otherwise the viewer will say, why are we looking at this ancient history? Yes.
تحضرني فكرة وهو اغتيال قضاة بإيطاليا. صحفيون استغلوا هذه الواقعة لكتابة قصة بشأن واقعة أخرى وهو اغتيال ألدمورو. أي استغلنا اغتيال قضاة. لم يفهم الكل لماذا اغتيلوا ومن اغتالهم. واستعملت هذه القصة لكي نرجع مرة أخرى إلى اغتيال ألدمورو لتبيان كيف تم اغتياله في نهاية المطاف على أساس مقاليد استقصائي.
Yeah. Sure. Why not? Okay, but that's a different strategy. What's being done there is you're using the present as a news hook to say we have unfinished business. Okay, so there the narrative strategy is much closer to this. Where we're in a present where judges are being assassinated and we say, no, they're not the only ones. Okay? And then hopefully we go to a future where assassination is no longer such a prominent part of Italian society and politics. We can dream. Okay? Excuse the cynicism of that remark. My favorite historian is Tacitus, who Napoleon considered the most cynical man who ever lived. Coming from Napoleon, that's quite a compliment. Okay. So, the past, for something that has never been revealed before, something that occurred a fair piece back, and we lead up to it, to the moment when something important is going to happen. All right, can you imagine a story that begins in the future? Ever read one? Ever read an investigation? An investigation that began in the future. An investigation, not science fiction. An investigation that began in the future. Have you ever read one? I wrote exactly one in my entire career to date. Yes.
الحديث عن قصة في المستقبل هو يتنافى والمعايير الصحفية. لماذا؟ لأن بالضبط أنه هناك أن يجب أن نتحدث عن حقيقة واقعة، عن حدث واقع وليس متخيلا. بالتالي فالحديث عن شيء متخيل هو أعتقد ضمن الأخلاقيات
You're absolutely right. This is a structural obstacle.
ولكن إسقاطات حول المستقبل أو تأويلات بطريقة فنية
Yes.
تأثير الظاهرة.
Absolutely, Mohammed. And this is a structural obstacle to this kind of story, and that's why it's so rare. I know of only one example from my own work, okay, where I was talking about Airbus building the A380, the giant jet. And they, they were building it based on projections of what the future would look like. So I said, okay, so this is what they think the future will look like. But there is one great, very significant example that I have been able to find in the history of investigative journalism that began in the future. Okay?
نعم.
Yes.
يعني يمكننا نتطرق إلى الصنف الآخر للكتابة الذي يعتمد على المنهاج المكاني.
What other genre?
le picaresque.
Wait. The picaresque is a literary genre that is based on a spatial organization of a narrative. We're going to get there in a moment, but we have to finish with this first. Okay? All right. So, the story I'm thinking of, 1984, it was the worst industrial catastrophe in history. It was worse than 9/11. Worse than 9/11. A chemical factory exploded in the middle of a densely populated Indian city. It was like a poison gas attack in the First World War. But it killed more people than any poison gas attack in the First World War. Because it was a dense urban area and people had no defense. Something like, 5 or 10,000 people died that morning. For 2 years preceding that accident, a reporter on the local newspaper had been publishing a story every week detailing how such an accident was going to occur. He was hearing from workers at the plant, even some managers at the plant, from neighbors. He became an expert in the chemistry that was being produced there. He saw very clearly what was happening. I believe his name was Raj Barriola. I have it in my notes if anyone is interested. This guy is an incredible hero of journalism. He's the only man I know who ever had such incredible foresight into an impending catastrophe. And he was not able to prevent the catastrophe. But one result of his work was that when the president of the American company that owned the factory, Union Carbide, flew to India to express his deep compassion for the poor people who were massacred by his stupid plant, when he got off the plane, he was arrested for murder. So this big American executive who feels so deeply for the victims of his operations is thrown in prison for killing them. I thought that was nice. Okay, he got out of prison, but I think he spent a very bad couple of nights there. Okay, wondering if he would ever get out, and how the Indians could dare to do this to him. So, here the structure is rather different. Okay, we're looking at the future. We're holding up the future in order to act on the present. The past hardly enters into it. It may be there at some point. We may hold it up as a counterexample. But the key focus is, if this is our future, what must we do now? I repeat, this is a very, very rare case until very recently. This is the narrative structure of investigation into climate change. Climate change is going to have a very profound impact on how investigations are done, because it's a phenomenon where we won't see the results we're starting to see results now. But it's been 30, 40 years that people have been talking about climate change, and we're only starting to see physical evidence now. So for journalists, this was an impossible story to cover, and it was very, very hard to sell this story to editors and to networks. You know, the first big documentary on climate change was not done by a journalist, it was done by Al Gore, a politician. Okay? And the people who made this a story, who followed the story, were not journalists. They were scientists and environmentalists who carried the story forward in their own media. Incidentally, there is excellent scholarly work on how those groups made climate change a story and made it important. I can give you the references, but you'll also find them in the book, Power is Everywhere. Power is Everywhere. Google that with my name, and you will find a free download. Well, you know, give me your email and I'll send you the link. It's a book about business models, okay, for media, but it talks about this case as well. This is a narrative structure that's becoming increasingly important in stakeholder-driven media, like the ones that talk about climate change, etc. We look at what the future is going to be if present trends continue, and then we talk about what must be done in the present. I repeat, until recently this was very rare, but it's becoming more common. Okay, any questions about this? Yes.
في بداية القصة الاستقصائية التي تعتمد بالمستقبل يعني الانطلاقة، أظن أنه من الأساس الاعتماد على آراء خبراء في مجالهم قد يعطوا يعني الإسقاطات التي تمكن من إثبات فرضيتي في العمل.
Sure, but this is you know, you can look at you can get the perspective of experts, but honestly, you're less interested in their perspectives than in the data they compiled in their research. One of the challenges for a reporter working on this kind of stuff is to become expert in the science. Now, to do that, they need a mentor, a guide. But it's very hard to avoid being manipulated, okay, by a scientist or, you know, because you're dealing with stuff that you don't really understand. If reporters were leading scientists, they would probably change jobs. Now, I know of one reporter who does this very well. His name is Mark Shapiro. Okay? Yeah, Mark Shapiro. And we have a story of his in the Global Investigative Journalism Casebook. Where he talks about how he covers the story of climate change. Okay? And you know, any student considering an inquiry into a scientific subject should read Mark's afterword. Now, this is an anthology. It's published by UNESCO, so it's free. Okay? And I was the editor. And I collected 24 stories from the journalists I admired. And from some I didn't know. I put out a call and people sent me stuff who I've never heard of. And the stories were a lot of fun. But I insisted that every reporter write a detailed afterwards saying exactly how they got the story, how they organized the material, and how they wrote the story. Okay? Those 3 points they had to cover. And Marx afterward talks about an incredible number of things. You know, first he reads the science. Then he looks for people who can guide him through the science. In other words, he's not the monkey saying, please tell me, eminent scientist, what you think. He's saying, I've read your work. I have these questions about your work. Okay, I want to know if this is a reasonable implication, if this makes sense, etc. You know, and he looks for these expert guides. Okay, have any of you read Dante's Inferno? Every journalist should read this book. First, because the structure of Dante's Inferno is replicated in a lot of investigations. I'm going to show you how in a moment. Okay, Dante created a structural model for investigation. But there's, pardon me?
Can you write it?
Yes.
Okay.
This is one of the great classics. This is one of the great classics of European literature, Inferno by Dante Alighieri. It's part of the Divine Comedy. In his life where he has lost his way, and a dangerous beast crosses his path. He's in danger. And just at that moment, the Roman poet Virgil appears and says, I am taking you away from here. And Virgil leads him into hell so that he can see what his life will be like if he crosses God. Okay? And Dante goes through hell, mapping the topography, meeting the people, telling you what every circle of hell looks like. Okay? And he has a guide. He's going into hell, but he's not stupid enough to go alone. He has somebody to guide him who knows everyone in hell. That person is Virgil. And by the way, the story is full of interviews. Dante interviews everyone he meets in hell. When Albert Londra wrote his investigation of the penal colony, the prison colony of Guyana, which I mentioned yesterday, he simply took Dante's structure. Structure defeats content. Structure is stronger than content. If your students are not looking at books in terms of structure, they will never be good writers. If they do not look at films in terms of structure, they will never be good documentarists. There is a book by Francois Truffaut. You all know Truffaut, the great French New Wave film director. Before Truffaut was a film director, he was a film critic. He used his criticism to prepare himself to be a director. And in that book, there is one essay where he looks at one of the greatest Western movies ever made, a movie by Robert Aldrich called Veracruz. And he breaks down the structure of the film. Just takes it apart to put together the structure. And it's, you know, it's amazing. He's showing you how you create a scenario, how a great scenario is created, and how a master structures the story. You know, this is just a personal tip, okay? But in the curriculum, one of the things we say that you should do is to tell your students, find a writer from your country who looked at a social problem. Could be a novelist, could be a poet, could be a filmmaker. And analyze that example in terms of structure, in terms of content. You know, what did they find that no one else found? How did that person do the investigation? If they cannot find someone anywhere else, okay, what you can do is go to the ARIDGE website and take an investigation off the website and say, analyze this. Tell me what the structure is. How is it structured scene by scene? What do you learn in those scenes? What's the content? Okay? If they don't learn how to do this, they will not advance as storytellers. Great storytellers look at other storytellers. Okay? Shakespeare took his plots from other writers. He took them from history books and he took them from Italian plays. He was not great at inventing stories, so he took the stories from someone who was great at it. Okay? And then added his own content to that structure. Anyone can do the same thing. Okay? Now Mark Shapiro, it's almost 11 o'clock. Let's take a 20-minute break. And then we are going to look at picaresque structures. Okay? Picaresque is the term. I don't think there's any direct translation into Arabian. But, you know, it's the spatial organization. So we will look at how that works, and then we are going to look at comedic and tragic curves. Between the three of these general structures, every one of your students will be able to produce a workable story. They only need those three tools. They can find others as they go through life. And with those three tools, they should be able to succeed. Okay, and by the way, I have also taught these tools at Al Jazeera, and they were useful. Okay, there were people who had problems with stories who were able to get out of them by using these tools. Okay, you will find all of these in the ARIDGE manual, but we go into greater detail in the curriculum. Okay? All right, let's take that break. 20 minutes. Time for a cigarette.
Thank you.
Time to lose your character.
Eat a banana.
And eat a banana, which will make you a better person.
But you should not go back to smoking.
Si vous voulez une cigarette, je vous l'offre. Je vous commande. We go from one place to the next. Okay? You know, I think that any student who's working with this structure, or any journalist who's working with these structures, should read these books. Okay? I admit that I haven't read Don Quixote, you know, the great Spanish work. But I've read the Odyssey, Chrétien de Troyes, and Huckleberry Finn, and they're all the same story. Someone starts from home, they leave home on a mission, and the mission takes them through different strange places. And in those places, adventures happen. There are combats. There are battles. There are liberations of people who are kept prisoner. There's love. There's adventure and wealth. Okay? These different things happen along the road. There's also tremendous freedom. Can anybody think of an example of a contemporary journalist who uses this structure? Someone who does investigations, by the way.
Yusri Fuda.
Yosri Fuda?
Yeah.
I don't know Yosri's work. I can't access it because it's in Arabic, you know, most of it.
when he استعمل هذا النمط عندما تحدث على رحلة الكورينت في تحقيق أشرف عليه مع رنا شكون اللي أعد تحقيق رحلة الكورينت
Was it when he went to see Bin Laden?
دولتشي بلا دولتشي بلا
سيد تركي.
سيد تركي.
رحلة الكورنيت كان عن تهريب الأسلحة
بليبيا
لمصر وبلش فيه احنا بنسمي هذا الاسلوب اسلوب طواحين الهواء، والانتقال من مشهد متكامل الى مشهد متكامل، مشهد الى بدايه وسط ونهايه، ومنخلصه بننتقل لمسار اخر، وممكن نستخدمه في حال كنا عم نكتب تحقيقات عم تتم مثلا بثلاث قرى بتونس او ثلاث اماكن متداخله، فاحنا بنسميه طواحين الهواء او دونكي شوت.
يمكن استعمالها مثلا في عمليات، واستعمل ايضا في ترحيل رحلات الهجره غير القانونيه السوريين عبر صحراء مصر الى.
This is the most common current use of this structure. Almost all the stories that are being done about migrants now are following this structure. They start with the migrants at home, they take them down the road, and it ends in another country or it ends in disaster. I mean, this is a very powerful structure for such stories. But it can be used as a natural gift. You know, eventually in a career, a journalist may use both structures, but, you know, students should be aware of their natural preferences. A couple of things to keep in mind if a student elects this kind of structure. Okay, one is because place is so important in this kind of story, they have to get a lot of details about the place. You know, in documentary work, you know, in French documentary work, we call it illustrations. You know, I don't know what you call it in Algerian TV. We call it les illus, you know, illustrations. And you know, it's very important to give people a sense of where they are and who they're about to meet. You know, so the student has to collect this information along with the facts. You know, students have a problem collecting facts, of course. You know, they think they don't have enough of them. But they also need to understand that this colorful information enables the comprehension of the viewer. If they don't have that, then, you know, the story is a loser. Okay? So keep that in mind. By the way, do you give your students the opportunity to submit their work in video form or in multimedia form? Do they have the opportunity to do this in your classes? Okay. Very good. Okay. Sometimes the picaresque structure can be a single place. Okay. I worked with a team of students in Vienna in January, and they wanted to do a story on bicycle accidents. Bicycle accidents in Vienna. They had figures showing that the number of people killed riding bicycles in Vienna was going up, and the number of accidents was going up. So, you know, they proposed a story that was very dry in statistics. Can you think of another way to do that story? A story about bicycle accidents. That would make it more visual, that would take it out of the factual sequence mode, you know, one fact after another, and put it into a more powerful setting. Can you think of how you would do that? Because this is something I do with my students as well. When they propose a story, I say, how are you going to tell the story from the start? Okay, I say, what is going to be the narrative structure that you're doing? How are you going to set this up? How are you going to make it come alive? We do that from the start, from the first time they propose a project. Okay, it's not just, is it a good story? It's not only, do you have a path forward? All the things we talked about over the last couple of days. It's also, how are you going to tell this story? That's part of the discussion too. Yes?
أعتقد أن طريقة سرد القصة depends، يعني مرتبط بالأساس بالمنصة وبالمتلقي. أي منصة سنعتمد؟ هل سنعتمد الصحافة الورقية كالعادة أم
Okay, great. So tell me what platform you would like to use for a story about bicycle accidents. First of all, what's your hypothesis? What causes bicycle accidents? What do you think causes bicycle accidents? Based on your knowledge and experience in watching people ride bicycles. Yes.
Peut-être les raisons des accidents, peut-être parce qu'il n'y a pas de... C'est ce qui se passe chez nous d'ailleurs, parce qu'il n'y a pas...
De couloir
Okay.
couloir et aussi ça peut être la route en elle-même, la route qui n'est pas bien
Okay.
Voilà.
So one of our hypotheses is the road isn't adapted to bicycles. Okay? Okay? Well, that's not a bad idea, but they also have bicycle accidents in Copenhagen and in Amsterdam where the bicycle routes are great. So that's a good reason, but it can't be the only reason. What other reasons are there? Yes.
ربما تكون السرعة يمكن
Speed.
يمكن مثلا أن أضيف بدلا من مجرد حوادث الدراجات دراجات الحوادث المميتة وأن أرجعها إلى عدم تطبيق التشريعات الخاصة بارتداء الخوذة.
Okay. You mean bicycles going too fast?
خصوصا الحوادث المميتة راجعة لعدم ارتداء الخوذة التي يتعين أن تفرض التشريعات ارتداء الخوذة.
Yes, but okay, he missed your first comment because the microphone was not on. What do you mean by speed? Who is going too fast?
الأخطاء يمكن أن نعيدها إلى خطأين، خطأ بشري وخطأ موضوعي. الخطأ البشري من السائق شاب نزق بمعنى يسرع وغير مكون، والآخر يرتبط بالمحيط الموضوعي بمعنى الطرق والتشريعات القانونية الطريقة.
Wait, let's just stay with the question I asked you, okay? You said speed is a factor.
سرعة السائق شاب.
Okay, so who is going too fast?
السائق
The rider is going too fast. The driver and the rider. Okay, so that's interesting. Notice what we've come up with so far. We've come up with the physical environment and we've come up with human error. The bicycle rider or the driver. Okay?
Il a parlé d'autre chose, Marc. Il a dit qu'il n'a pas porté le casque.
Il a dit quoi?
Il ne porte pas le casque.
Oui, j'ai entendu ça. J'ai entendu ça. But that's not how the accident starts. The accident doesn't start because of a helmet. The accident starts because someone made a mistake or the road is bad. These are the things we've come up with. Okay? All right. So that's very interesting. So how would we show rider or driver error? Yes, Ahmed.
أنا عندي فكرة أخرى من شأنها أن تكون وراء فرضية. كل وسائل التنقل تستلزم رخصة السياقة وتداريب إلا الدراجة. الدراجة حاليا أصبحت وسيلة نقل لأن هناك ازدحام وما إلى ذلك، ولكن أغلبية الناس يستعملونها في أماكن مزدحمة دون أن يعلموا أي شيء عنها.
Okay. I agree, that's an interesting idea, but it's an idea for an editorial. You know, we can investigate the possibility that licenses can be installed. We can look at that as a solution. But let's focus now on how we are going to represent the question of how we show rider or driver error. How will you do this? Yes.
يمكن العمل على ضبط مكامن عدم احترام قانون الطرقات. والمخالفات المسجلة.
Okay, so what we are going to do, if I understand you correctly, is we are going to identify hot spots where accidents occur. Okay? That's part of the solution we adopted. We said, where do the accidents occur in Vienna? Okay, so we go to those places. We look at the condition of the road. Okay? What else do we do? Yes.
سأقترح حد سرعة قصوى بالنسبة للدراجة والسيارات على مستوى المناطق الآهلة وفي أوقات الذروة، أوقات الناس يذهبون إلى عملهم ويعودون. هذا بالنسبة للمناطق الآهلة. بالنسبة للطرق السيارة البعيدة سأقترح زيادة حد قصوى أيضا للسرعة بالنسبة لصاحب الدراجة وبالنسبة لصاحب السيارة.
Okay, but this is the solution. We are getting ahead of the story. How do we show what happens in the hotspots? What do we do? We have identified places where accidents occur. Okay? Perhaps what you are saying is that people are not respecting speed limits. But how do we show this? How will we show it?
إقامة رادارات مثلا لكشف السرعة وتفعيل دور شرطة الطرق من أجل معاينة.
Failure. Everything looks great, and then something falls off the tracks. It's the story of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Okay? Okay, of course, the great tragedy writers, we think of Shakespeare before anyone else. You know, I think students should read Shakespeare. What the hell? Again, students want to invent structures. This is very foolish. We have thousands of years of literary and, in the last couple centuries, cinematic experimentation where people have developed structures that they can borrow. You know, why would we invent the wheel? We can refine the wheel, we can make a different kind of wheel, but we're not going to invent wheels. So, if a student tells you that I want to do such and such kind of story, don't hesitate to suggest to them people who have done similar kinds of stories, or literary people. You know, when I was working in Paris on a book about a kidnapping that ended with the death of the woman who was kidnapped, okay, very complex crime story, I read Balzac. I took Balzac's book, Splendor and Miseries of the Courtesans, because it had all the same elements of my story. Someone high in the government, lawyers, criminals, art, poetry. All of these things happened in my story. And the only author I could find who had put them together into one package was Balzac. So I read Balzac to see how he put things together and what effects he used. And by the way, I learned something very important about Balzac, from Balzac, which is that in the middle of very grim affairs, things can happen that are absolutely ludicrous. There's a scene in that book where a poet has been imprisoned in Paris. He's in a dungeon. And he's been pardoned because his mistress, the wife of a powerful man, has obtained a pardon. So the jailers are going to free him. And they discover that he's hung himself. He's killed himself in his cell. And they start shrieking, "The beautiful poet is dead. The man who incarnated love is dead. This is a terrible tragedy." And then one of them says, "Hey, he hung himself off the window frame and he bent the metal." So they forget the cadaver and start worrying about the window frame. Okay, that was fiction. But there were scenes in my story that were like that. And I would not have used those scenes if I hadn't seen from Balzac how effective they could be. You know, how powerful it would be to suddenly shift gears from something horrible to something ridiculous. And how this brings you into the senseless, you know, the madness of these affairs where people lose their minds, and from one minute to the next they become different people. So I look at the kind of story I'm going to tell, I see what writers have used a similar approach or a similar structure, and I see what I can take from that. And I tell my students to do this too. I ask them to write a report on the literary or the structural effects that people are using in a given work. I make them study someone they can use as a model. Okay? Now, this is the comedic curve. Comedy. Not because it's funny, not because it's a joke. It's called a comedy because it ends well. As Shakespeare said, all is well that ends well. And in the comedy, we start in a place where everything is fine. We're in the world of normal reality, okay, where the world functions more or less well. We get up in the morning, we're happy to see the wife and kids or to go to school. We go about our business, and then something happens. And we realize that this normal state of affairs is a lie or an illusion. There's a problem that we weren't taught about. Okay? The wonderful advances in medical technology have helped to create a generation of handicapped kids. The invention of the electric drill enables us to make holes in concrete, but it makes it so difficult to understand each other over the noise. So we find out that the world that we thought was fine is terrible. And then we try to get out of that hole and go back to the light. Now, this is the prototypical structure of an investigation. Because we're telling people something they didn't know about how the world is going off the tracks. And if we want them to finish the story with a sense of hope, we have to lead them back toward the light. We can't just leave them here, okay, down in the dumps, walking through hell without a guide. We have to lead them back out. This is why Dante Alighieri, the great Italian poet, called his masterwork, a trilogy, the Divine Comedy. Because in the first volume, he takes you back to hell. And then he leads you on the long path to redemption in heaven. Okay? This is a structure that is hardwired into the human consciousness. This structure lives in everyone. If your students cannot handle a more sophisticated structure, well, there are sophisticated ways of doing this. I don't mean it's not sophisticated. But if they don't have another solution, it's very simple. You say to them, take everything that leads toward the bottom and put it here. One after the other, take us one step closer to the bottom with every turn of the wheel. We really need to turn that thing off before we all freeze to
This
death.
one?
Why don't we just unplug it?
Okay.
Okay. The stuff that we do that leads us toward the top, back to the light, we put here. So it's like building a stairway down to the cellar and then building a stairway back up to the first floor. I know, it's a bank robbery. They're tunneling into the bank next door.
I told them downstairs. I'm worried it's the neighbors.
The neighbors.
Yeah.
The problem of city life, or any life, is neighbors. Just a little aside, Jean-Paul Sartre is not my favorite author, but he did say something that really captures the French mentality. He said, hell is everyone else. Hell is everyone else. Yeah, l'enfer c'est les autres. Yeah. L'enfer c'est les autres. Okay. So, they tell you the story they want to do. Okay, so, is the bicycle story a tragedy or a comedy? Okay, why is it a tragedy?
لأن تترتب عليها إزهاق لأرواح ومساس وإيذاء بشري وتكلفة اقتصادية كبيرة وأمور جنائية.
Okay. Well, okay. If we look at it in terms of narrative movement, we can support your argument. Here is where everyone discovers that bicycles are a solution to climate change. Everybody should be on a bicycle which doesn't burn oil. And this is where we discover that there's a lot of problems with bicycles and we're going down because people are getting killed, because there's economic loss, because nobody is enforcing it. We keep going down until we come back up and find a solution. So we can start that story as a tragedy, take it all the way down and turn it into a comedy when we get back on the right track. We just have to follow the curve a little longer. So yes, let's start the story as a tragedy, the betrayal of the promise of bicycles. And then we'll find a solution to the problems, and everything is knowledge and how it's used and how people work together. Okay? Yes.
تجربتي البسيطة في مجال دفع الطلبة لمتابعة التطورات في مجال الصحافة الاستقصائية. كان في برنامج تاش انفستيجيشن، وكنت كل ما أقرأ تحقيق على الاستقصائي.
Yeah, it's a great show.
كل ما أطلع على تحقيق استقصائي جيد أقدر أنه جيد من منطلق تجربتي الخاصة البسيطة، نبعث لهم اللينك، نبعث لهم الرابط للاطلاع عليه ومناقشته في الحصة التي تليها. يكونوا هم بهذه الطريقة مدفوعين لأنه يجوني حاضرين لمناقشة هذا التحقيق وكيف تدرج الطالب إنه يكون عندنا يعني نبعث اللينك ونبعث معه يعني نبعثوا إيميل خاص لكل طالب، حتى وأنا منزلة على الإيميل بتاعي الميل تراكر حتى نشوف الطالب فتح الإيميل ولا لا. نعرف إنه هو طلع على الإكسرسايز ولا لا، يعني طلع على التمرين ولا لا. يكون فيه اللينك بتاع العمل ويكون فيه المعطى بتاع يعني عناصر النقاش اللي باش نناقشوا فيها، يعني يجيو اوريدي حاضرين للنقاش الفرضيه او الاسلوب الكتابه او كيف اعد، يعني كيف تمكن من التحقق من الفكره. اجدها ناجعه خاصه اذا انت تكون تدرس الماده ككل مش كجزء. وحتى في الجزء وقت اللي كنت في معهد الصحافه ندرس فرضيه فقط، بناء الفرضيه والماستر فايل والتايم لاين، كنت نشتغل على تحقيقات اوريدي معموله ونستخرج منها فرضيه، نعطيهم اقرا انت التحقيق طلع منه الفرضيه وكيف تم تنظيم المعلومات فيها. نشوفوا انه احنا ندفع يعني من تجربتنا، احنا ندفعهم للقراءه، نختار لهم الحاجه مش هم يتبعوني فيها.
Okay. Yes. Who else has a comment? Yes.
في الغالب وفي مجال القانون هو يختلف بعض الشيء من التصوير ومن السينما وما إلى ذلك، فأنا لا أنتظر منهم أن يقرأوا كتابا بالكامل عن القانون الدولي، عن قانون الإعلام، لأنهم لن يفعلوا ذلك. الذي لاحظته هو أنهم يختارون في أقصى حد يختارون ما يقرؤون، أو كسالى يقرؤون أجزاء من الكتاب فقط. وبالتالي فالذي لاحظته هو أنه يقرؤون مقالات أكثر ما يقرؤون كتب، وهذا جيد كذلك لأن المقالات أدق من الكتب العامة أي من التكست بوك.
Okay. Do you use case studies?
Yes.
Okay. In law schools and business schools, the classic educational technique is case studies. Okay? You can use average investigations as case studies. Typically, the classroom method in case studies is very similar to what Bahija is doing. Okay? You set forth a story and there is a problem that must be solved in the story. Okay, for example, your students could walk into the class. I used the bicycle story as a case study here. Okay? We set forth a problem. Bicycle riders are getting killed. Okay? The problem is, how are we going to tell the story? So we set people to work thinking of different ways to solve the story. Now our case study can be more or less detailed. Okay, you can take an investigative article as a case study, or you can take a story in the newspaper as a case study and say, how will we turn this into an investigation? What is there to investigate? Okay? The only requirement, if you are going to take a case study approach, is that you absolutely have to know the case forward and back. You have to know the story and how it turns out. You know, not just what is in the case, because if you tell them everything, it's not a case study, it's a lecture. If you stop with the story, you have to know how that story would turn out before you begin to teach it, okay? Because you have to lead people toward the conclusion of the case. That doesn't mean, you know, that, well, you know, it can be equally useful to have them make mistakes as to get it right. You know, sometimes case studies put them in a difficult position. Now, there are two ways of using case studies that, you know, you should all know. One of them is to illustrate a situation. Okay? If you are asking students to analyze a story, you are using the material as an illustration. How did Michael Moore create this narrative? Okay. What are the scenes? What is the rhythm? How does he use the camera, etc.? It's an illustration, so you're discussing the specific techniques that he's using to get something done. Okay, and his material is the illustration of the techniques. The second way of using case studies is as a simulation. A simulation of a real-world experience. And this is what we did with the bicycle story. Okay, we simulated the problem of creating a storytelling a storytelling strategy around a specific story. Which of those two approaches do you think is most effective? And why? To illustrate or to simulate? Yes.
I think it depends. I think to introduce something, the illustration is beneficial, but the simulation would have them more engaged. So I think that I would do both, to get them to understand it and then have them do it. But maybe but different cases.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Both of them are good.
Yeah.
أظن بأن الإليوستريشن والسيميوليشن كلهما جيد. لماذا؟ لأن الإليوستريشن هو لكي نظهر ما وقع في بعض الأحيان لصحفي تنكر أو استعمل كاميرا خفية أو ما إلى ذلك. وفي بعض الأحيان حينما يتعلق الأمر باستعمال بعض الطرق في مقصود التحقيق، فمن الأحسن أن نعمل سيميوليشن لكي يرى ما هي المخاطر التي سيواجهها، وبالتالي فكلتا الطريقتين جيدة حسب الحالات.
Okay. When would you use illustration?
illustration
لبعض الأمور التي وقعت. والسيميوليشن بالنسبة للأمور التي من شأنها أن تقع إذا لم أتخذ الاحتياطات كصحفي استقصائي.
Okay.
أظن أن استعمال الillustration
Pardon me just a moment, Hija, I want to return to this.
in the sense
Yeah, I need to say something more about that. Okay, simulation to see things that might happen if we don't pay more attention. For example, we use the bicycle story to focus attention on how you would tell this story so that you don't do a bad job of telling it. Is this what you mean? Have I understood?
No.
Okay, please.
أنا أتكلم عن الجوانب القانونية فيما يخص طرق العمل بتاع.
Okay. You're speaking about the use of case studies in legal education.
In legal cases.
Okay. Well, in general terms, I think what you're saying is very valid, and I see absolutely no reason why you could not apply that to teaching investigative work. Okay, you can use that. You have to use what you can do anyway, what you know how to do. So apply that. Let us know how it works. Okay, that approach. What were you thinking, Bahija?
أنا يعني بالنسبة لي استعمال illustration هو اللي.
And I'm just going to check the material. Okay. Generally, students do a terrible job with investigative interviews.
Even journalists.
Most journalists do a terrible job too. Okay. So the first game we're going to play is called Said, Not Said. What did someone say and what did they not say? Okay? Here is the fact. A big French company has been hit with a national consumer boycott because of a leak. Okay? A leak that they are closing factories. So in January, there is a leak. Strikes break out. In April, a national boycott begins. In May, a rumor, not a fact, not a documented fact, but a rumor is reported in the press, which says the company's sales are down 10 to 15%. Okay? Everybody with me so far? We're now 5 months into the story. There are strikes, there's a boycott, and now there's a rumor that sales are down 15%. Okay? This is a multinational company based in France. All right. End of May. The CEO of the company, the head of the company, addresses the general shareholder meeting. He is standing in front of the general shareholder meeting. His words have legal weight. He is required by law to tell the truth to his shareholders. We all understand this? Can't lie about the business. He says the boycott and strikes had no effect on group results despite a halt to all advertising in France. The storm is over. That is what he said. What did he not say? Pardon me? What did he not say?
The mic.
The microphone, please.
هذه الأشياء التي قالها مسؤول الشركة أو مدير الشركة ربما الأشياء التي لم يكشف عنها مثلا الخسائر النتائج.
What losses? What losses? He said the boycott and strikes had no effect on group results.
Monsieur?
What losses? He said there were no losses. What did he not say?
The losses in France.
Say it into your microphone, please.
تحدث بصفة عامة عن الشركة على الصعيد العالمي وتفادى.
Why do you say that? Okay. So, the boycott and strikes had no effect on group results. What about the group?
إنها مجموعة عالمية.
It's a multinational group. But he said there was no effect despite a halt to all advertising in France. So?
للتغطية على ما خسروا في فرنسا. هذا ما لم يقله.
Yes. He said nothing about France. The boycott was in France. He only talked about group results.
Yes.
He did not say anything about France. In France, the rumor was true. They lost 10 to 15% of their sales. He did not lie, but he did not say it.
He didn't say the truth.
I agree. He paid for it later. This is a true story. I did not make this story up. I investigated this story. I would like you to know that, pardon me?
To bring my children from the school.
How dare you use your children as an excuse to make me feel
sure,
cruel.
No, sure. I don't have no one in me.
I am a heartless guy, Bahija, but I will forgive you.
I'm so sorry, but my husband at work.
I don't want to know about your husband. This is your private business. See you later.
I see you later.
Okay. So, this is a true story. I would like you all to know something, which is that the night he said this, there were 600 reporters in the room. I read every one of their reports. Every one. There was exactly one reporter who said, he said nothing about France. One. Maybe the others wanted the advertising to come back, so they were eager for the crisis to be over. So now that you have seen what he did not talk about, he also said, the storm is over. What is your hypothesis about the truth of that statement? He says the storm is over. Do you believe that statement? Redouane.
هو صحيح أن ممكن أن العاصفة مرت، ولكن آثار العاصفة هي الأساس. ما يهمنا هو ما أحدثته العاصفة. أما العاصفة قد تمر، ربما بدأت المبيعات تدخل في نوع من الاستقرار، ولكن كلمة العاصفة لا تقول لنا شيئا يعني في الحقيقة.
Okay.
دقيقة عامة.
Okay. Now let us think about what has just happened here. Okay? Now we have the luxury of thinking about things after the event. In the middle of a big social crisis for one of France's biggest companies like this, people's emotions tend to get in the way of their insight. That's how 599 reporters can miss the story and one can get. Okay? But, did he tell us the truth? Did he tell us the truth? Did he lie outright? No.
He lied diplomatically.
He lied by omission. He didn't tell us about France. He just left France out. So, we know that this guy does not tell the entire truth. Correct? I mean, what he does not say tells us who he is. Not let anyone know I have it. But if I find the information from another source that is public, I will use it. Pardon me?
قصدت أنك تحذره إذا وجدت المعلومة خارج مكانها سيستعملها.
No, I'm giving him a definition. I say off the record means that I cannot use this and I cannot let anyone know that I have this information, but I can find it in another place, which will not come back to you. Okay? Because look, once you know something, you can find a source. Once you know that something happened, you can find a way to document it. So, off the record does not mean that you cannot use the information ever again. It means if you can't find it someplace else, you can't use it. Okay? Pardon me?
كنت أود أن أقول بأن هؤلاء الذين يقولون لي مثلا هذه خارج التسجيل أستفيد من تلك المعلومة وأستغلها، لا أنسبها إليهم ولكن أستغلها وفق المقتضيات الفنية التي لا تجعلها تكتسي صبغتها القطعية، ولكن دون أن أنسب إليها بعضا. أستغلها تماما كالمحاضر القضائي. كل محاضر قضايا الجرائم تصلني.
Hossein, this is not about practice here, this is about definition. What you have just described is not off the record. It is not for citation. If you use the information, but without attributing it to a specific source, then it is on the record, but it is not for citation.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So what that means is that will be like a quote you see in a story where you say, if you say, for example, a senior official with knowledge of the negotiations said. So this is someone who is giving you information that can be used publicly, but you cannot cite them. That is not the same as off the record. Off the record means you can't cite it unless you find another source. That's what it means, very specifically. Okay? At least where I work. I think it's important because if a source says to you, this is off the record, you can negotiate with the source. You can say, do you mean that you don't want me to use the information, or that you do not wish to be identified as the source. If he says, I don't want to be identified as the source, then you can say, how many other people know this information? Okay? And if he says, well, you know, a certain number, you can say, if I cite the information, not your name, will they know it came from you? I allow the source. I think this is professional practice. You allow the source to make that decision. They are running bigger risks than us. They have the right to decide whether or not they want to be quoted at all or by name. But if the source says you can use the information but not my name, that means I write in the margin NFC, not for citation, which is not the same as off the record. Okay, do you see this distinction? And the final category, of course, is on the record. Okay? All right. These are the distinctions that we use in Europe and the United States. You don't have to use them here, but I want to be clear about the distinction because students will not know it. They'll say, oh, off the record, sure, but they don't know what they're talking about. Whatever definition you use with them, you have to be very clear about what it means, okay? And what your own practice is. They will not know it on their own. They will not have your experience. And the meaning can change in different places. Okay, so the definition you gave may be the one that has to be used in Mauritania. If it's the one that everybody understands, that's what it is. Okay, but make sure that your students understand exactly what the distinctions are. Okay? Yes? Okay.
هو تمييز أساسا بين أريد أن أوضح أنه يتعين بكل تأكيد التمييز بين المصادر المغلقة أو المصادر التي لا تريد أن تحدث عن نفسها والمصادر التي يطالب صاحبها بأن المعلومة أصلا تبقى خارج التسجيل. الأول نحن نستخدم كثيرا مصادر مقربة، مصادر كشف آثارت عدم الكشف عن اسمها، نستخدمها دائما الصيغة الفنية الملائمة لذلك، ولكن هي معلومات حصلنا عليها صاحبها فقط لا يريد أن يتحدث. الحالة الأخرى هي حال معلومات حصلت عليها وصاحبها يريد أن تبقى المعلومة وصاحبها خارج دائرة التوطين، وهذه يجب التعامل معها بذكاء تماما كالمخاطر القضائية.
Can I take something?
Yes, unless we can find another source. For example, if someone else gives us the document and gives us permission to use it, then we can use it whether or not the other person asked us to keep it off the record. And this is very frequent, okay? In that case, you can call the first source and say, look, somebody else gave me this document. It is going to be on the record. You know, if you trust the source enough, you know, and if they're not going to do something bad to stop you from using the document. But, okay, so in any case, let's go back to the question of assets. Off-the-record information is an important asset because it tells us where to look. It tells us what we're looking for. We're looking for a way to get that information into the public record. So this is an important asset. There are still a couple of other assets that haven't come up, and I'd like you to think about this, okay? Because, you know, you're going to be having this discussion with your students. I think you should, in any case. You know, thinking to them about all the things they can do with an interview besides getting answers to a question. You know, so that they maximize the value that they get out of this encounter. What else might be important to us that we could get from this conversation with the person? We already have a pretty good list, but there's still a couple of things that are missing.
ربما تكون نسخ من إحصائيات يعني أرقام معينة، نسخ من تقارير سرية في إدارة من إدارات الوزارات يعني.
We have that on our list now. We already have that on our list.
ممكن شهادات ناس آخرين أو شهادته هو حول الموضوع هذا.
Well, those are assets as well, but we will get those in other interviews. Okay? So you see, this is a different way of thinking of things, isn't it? It's a different way of thinking of it. Let me give you, okay, Redouane?
ربما في أسماء مؤسسات.
We already have that on our list.
Okay.
We already have that on our list.
maybe not وربما توقيت النشر حصلت على معلومة، حصلت على وثائق، إذا ممكن أن يشترط علي متى أنشر، وهذا التوقيت مهم بالنسبة لي أنا كصحفي. The timing. When?
Sure, but that's
to release.
Well, you could look at that as an asset in terms of the relationship. The relationship with the source is an asset in a different way from the way it is for a news reporter. An investigative reporter may see the same source a dozen times, may call them a dozen times. The relationship is an asset. Okay? And the relationship should be based confidence.
Confiance.
Yes. Well,
Why not
bling. He was spending his people's money on, prestige items. The chairs weren't particularly comfortable, but they were certainly expensive. He was wearing a particular kind of suit and a particular kind of tie. I don't buy those kinds of clothes, but I know what they cost. I meet other people, maybe they have their shirt buttoned up all the way. Maybe the shirt looks like it's strangling it. That tells you something about the kind of person they are too. Are they wearing designer eyeglasses? How much jewelry do they have on their hands?
His car.
His car. What kind of car does he drive? Okay? What does he care about? These sorts of things, does he have a scrapbook of pictures of himself with famous people? I interviewed a lawyer like that once. He was a total bastard, but he certainly knew a lot of famous people. Okay? What can we notice in that office that gives us insight into the person? These are assets. If your people if you send your students to interview someone, tell them, I don't just want answers to the questions. I want to know what this guy's environment is. Yes?
مهم في كثير من البلدان.
I'm sorry, what are you speaking English?
Okay.
No, what are you speaking? Because I was getting Arabic in the headphones.
No.
You were speaking in Arabic.
Yes.
Please speak in Arabic again.
Yes.
Okay.
فيما يخص هذا الأسد الذي تحدث عنه بالفعل مهم في البلدان العربية. حينما تدخل على المسؤول مهم هل توجد صورة الرئيس في مكتبه أم لا؟ هل توجد صورة للشخص مع الملك مع الرئيس مع كذا أم لا؟ يعطينا فكرة عن الشخص.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes.
الصور عادة ما تعطي دليل واضح على العلاقات أو على الاستيلاء على المال. في التحقيق بتاع خديجة إسماعيلوفا.
Well, you can't.
في تحقيق لخديجة إسماعيلوفا صورة كانت محددة في إثبات العلاقة بين ابنة الرئيس والبروكسي.
Your prestige is based on whether or not you speak to the people at the top. This is Christiane Amanpour. If you look at Christiane Amanpour's show on CNN, she says, I speak to the newsmakers. Well, okay, but are the newsmakers the ones who are going to give you the best information?